Okay, so welcome to week 2. We're going through the Roman family. There's a few terms up on the board that I want people to be familiar with. I will actually do a proper printed list of this later on with some definitions, and probably just add to it as we go, because if I try and do a comprehensive one now, I'll just forget something. So we'll just kind of like add to it as we go. But for now, familia basically means the household. So it's a broader term than our term family. Our term family comes from it, but it means a household. So in the Roman sense, it would include relatives, slaves, freedmen, and people like that. Paterfamilias is the head of the familia. Literally means father of the family, and it's the oldest living male in that particular direct line in the family. Potestas means legal power. So we'll talk about that in a moment. Potestas is legal power, the power that the father of the paterfamilias had over his household. Manus is power in marriage, in that the wife was considered to be under the power of her husband. Very sexist, I know, but we are dealing with Romans 2,000 years ago, so that shouldn't really surprise us. But manus was used to describe that power. It was distinct from potestas, and we'll have a look at some of those distinctions. Sui juris means under your own power, so a legally independent person. And alieni juris means under the power of another, so under someone else's control. So if you had a paterfamilias, your family, if you were subject to the paterfamilias, you would be alieni juris, you're under the control of another. Whereas if you are the paterfamilias, you could be sui juris, and there are various other ways of becoming sui juris, which we'll talk about later too. So some widows, for example, would be sui juris. They would be under their own control. They would be legally independent. So the fundamental building block of Roman society is the familia, the household. And so it was used for all kinds of, in all kinds of senses. As I say, the term familia, we tend to use the word family, but in our sense it usually means just a nuclear family, parents and children, whereas in the Roman sense it was broader than that. So lots and lots of people attached to the household. The largest of all was the Familia Caesaris, which is the household of the emperor. And there will be literally thousands of people in the Familia Caesaris. So there would be thousands of slaves, freedmen, and various other people, relatives, who are a part of that overall household. Now the head of every household was the paterfamilias. So this is the person who was in charge, the oldest living male. In theory, the paterfamilias had absolute control over his family. He was the legal owner of any property held by any member of the family. So if, for example, you are a son, but you have a living father, you, in theory at least, can't own anything. You can't buy any land. It will be the property of the paterfamilias of that family. So he would retain control over all of the land, all of the property, slaves held by every member of the household. In theory, they all belong to one man, the paterfamilias. Now, the extent to which they actually used this power varied from time to time. And generally speaking, it seems like early on in the early Republic, hundreds of years before the time we're talking about, that was very widely practiced. And then as time went on, those powers tended to be less and less used and less common. But they still legally existed. Sometimes you could take specific legal steps to emancipate. Emancipate basically means you are freed from the potestas of another. So potestas, that's that legal power held by the paterfamilias, and so you could take legal steps in order to emancipate yourself. Now, if you're a slave, that meant being set free. You were still a freed man, so you're emancipated in that sense, but in the sense we're talking about now, you're actually legally separated from the power, usually of your father. There might be various reasons why this would take place. And when that happened, you then became paterfamilias of your own family, and you were sui iuris, you were under your own power. Ordinarily, that only happened when the paterfamilias died, but it could happen under certain legal steps as well, and that's referred to as emancipation. This power seems to be unique to Rome. Most other ancient cultures, once you sort of like separated and formed your own household, you then became legally independent of your former household. But it doesn't work that way under the Roman system. Roman history, early Roman history and semi-mythology is replete with examples of people actually exercising this power. For example, Marcus Junius Brutus, the founder of the Republic, back in 510 BC, is reputed to have executed his own two sons under this power because they tried to bring back the monarchy. So what had happened is that Rome had been ruled by kings, but a group of aristocrats led by Brutus had actually expelled the kings and had established a republic. So it was dominated by those aristocrats. Brutus's sons wanted to bring back the monarchy, and he had them executed. But they weren't tried and executed for treason. They were executed basically under his potestas because he had the right to do it as their paterfamilias. That legal right continued to exist right through the imperial period, but it seems like it was less and less actually employed. So there are all these stories circulating in the imperial period of how strict and severe the paterfamilias of the Republic had been, of the early Republic, hundreds of years before, which kind of indicates that that kind of thing was not happening in their own time. So even though the legal power still existed, most Romans would kind of recoil at the idea of someone executing their own son. Probably the worst that would happen under the late Republic or the imperial period was that the father would possibly exile or disinherit his son. And that was probably as far as it went. But in theory, he could do pretty much anything he wanted. The fact is, there were probably not that many men who had many fathers who had adult sons, because about 50% of babies born would die before their 10th birthday, and that's even in the aristocracy. So infant mortality was very high. And only about 20% of those babies would actually live to their 60th birthday. So 60 is now kind of like an age that most people would reasonably expect to live to. But back in those days, only about 20% of people would actually make it as far as their 60th birthday. 20% of babies born would actually be 60 years old. So many adult men, most adult men, probably did not have a living father anyway. So, a 3 or 4 generation family was probably quite a rare thing. So there probably wasn't that many opportunities for those kind of events to happen. Now, the power of life and death, on the other hand, was often exercised over slaves. So the paterfamilias, as well as having that power over his own children and every other member of the household, certainly had that over slaves, and he did not have to do anything else in order to have a slave punished or even crucified. So he could actually order a slave crucified because he wanted to. Didn't actually have to give a reason, didn't have to get anybody else's permission. Again, as time went on, that became less and less common, and in the imperial period there seemed to be some regulations brought in. We'll look at them a little bit when we talk about slavery. But there were some things brought in that meant that this happened less and less often. It was kind of a few legal obstacles put in the way of executing a slave. So just to stop people just doing it because they felt like it. You've got to remember, of course, that a slave was usually quite expensive to purchase. It's roughly the idea, same kind of cost range as our buying a car. So it could be everything from a crummy second-hand car, so like a beat-up commie or something like that, might be a barbarian slave who can neither read or write and might be good for manual labour, whereas like a really high-end car might be the equivalent of a highly educated Greek slave or something like that, who could teach your children or whatever, or someone who's very highly trained in a craft or something along those lines. Get lost, boys, did we?
Yeah.
Yeah, we don't. Okay, so obviously people aren't just like executing slaves just because they feel like it because they're having a bad day or something like that. But it certainly did happen. There was certain social sanctions that began to appear, particularly in the imperial period, against a paterfamilias, acting in particular towards his wife and children in that way. So I'll talk a little bit about the legal status of wives in a moment. But for example, a paterfamilias would legally be able to do whatever he wanted to his wife, but someone who was considered to be a wife beater was actually someone who was very much looked down on in Roman society. And so informally, what actually took place was quite different sometimes from the laws. But the idea of the father as the head was something that was very deeply entrenched in Roman society. One of the titles of the emperor was Pater Patriae, which means father of the fatherland. And the oldest man in the Senate was called the father of the Senate. In fact, in the Australian Senate, they still use that term for the longest serving senator. So the idea of patriarchy, the idea of control by the father of the entire family, is something that's very deeply entrenched in Roman society. Now, from the father we go to consideration of the Roman mother, and she is referred to sometimes the Mater Familias. A Roman woman of the upper class would basically pretty much always be married. She could often be married as young as 13. So that was considered to be a legally permissible age to marry. And almost all women were married by their early 20s. There were very few exceptions, and we'll talk a little bit about some of those, but generally speaking, most women would expect to be married. The match was usually organised by the respective families, and actually, falling in love with someone or anything like that was pretty much never a part of it. It was something that was just accepted and done. It was arranged. Particularly in the upper class, it usually had more to do with the political needs of the father rather than anything else. So he would marry his daughters off to likely political allies and so forth. For example, Julius Caesar, his daughter was named Julia, as would be expected because his name is Julius. And he was forming an alliance with the Roman general Gnaeus Pompeius, and he married his daughter off to Pompey as a part of that deal. As it turned out, Pompey was very affectionate toward her, and they seem to have actually loved one another, and he was grief-stricken when she died, but Julia didn't actually get any choice in how that happened. So affection and conjugal love were expected to develop during the course of a marriage, but they were very rarely a precondition to it actually taking place. Usually the groom would be at least 5 years older than his wife, so she could in theory be 13, he would be about 18 usually. Often at those ages the marriage wasn't consummated straight away. They would actually wait for a while, but they would be considered to be legally married at that time. It could actually take place early. Now in the old form of marriage, which was common under the Roman Republic, the daughter actually went from the potestas of her paterfamilias to the potestas of her husband's family. So that was the old form of marriage. But by the time we're studying, that form of marriage had pretty much died out. And instead, she stayed under the potestas of her own father, usually her father or the paterfamilias of her family, although she was under the manus, the direct control of her husband. But that meant that in the event of divorce or something like that, she sort of like had members of her family could still legally represent her, and she could be taken back under their power. So it gave her more protection and a place to return in the event of a divorce. Particularly in richer families, she would be provided when she got married with a dowry. That was intended to maintain her. So it was the expense of keeping her, basically. That was given to the husband. However, in the event of divorce or the husband's death, it actually reverted, or the wife's death for that matter too, it reverted to her family. So if he divorced her, he also had to give her dowry back. But the idea of that was a sum of money that was supposed to help to maintain her, to look after her. Originally, all women needed a legal guardian, that is a male guardian, in order to own property or to do a lot of legal transactions, transact in any business or to own any property. But Augustus actually relaxed some of those rules. So Augustus was the first emperor. So those are the years that he reigned, from 31 BC to AD 14. So he's the first person that we know of as the actual Roman emperor. Prior to that, it was a republic, which is an aristocracy basically. But he changed the laws and actually made it possible for a woman who had 3 children, because he wanted to encourage population growth. He wanted Roman citizen women to have babies, and they were then considered to be Roman citizens because they're from a Roman citizen family. So he wanted to increase the number of Roman citizens. And so he said if a woman had 3 children, if a citizen woman had 3 children, then she did not have to have a male guardian in order to purchase property or conduct any business transactions. And there were female business women, business people, who were active in Roman society. We'll look a little bit at those next week, I think, when we talk about the role and status of women. And also, if you're a freed woman, that is, you had been a slave, that number was raised to 4. So you actually had to have 4 children. Now, for it to be a legal Roman marriage, which meant that the children would be Roman citizens, the father had to be a Roman citizen, and the woman he married did not have to be a Roman citizen, but she had to be either a citizen or having the Latin rights, which is sort of like a secondary form of citizenship, or be of a foreign people that had the right of connubium. That is the rights of marriage. If that was met, it was a legal Roman marriage, and that meant any children born of that marriage would be Roman citizens. If, however, a Roman citizen male slept with a slave, for example, which often happened because the slaves were in their total power, any children of that union would not be Roman citizens, they would be considered slaves. So it's only from a legal Roman marriage that Roman citizens can be born. They had to have a Roman citizen father and a woman who had right of marriage. And in a legal marriage, that then would result in Roman citizens. Any other children born, even if they had a Roman citizen father, if it was not a legal marriage, they took the status of the mother. And if that status was slave, then those children would be slaves. And that was not at all uncommon. Divorce was quite easy in the Roman world. It happened a lot, particularly in aristocratic families where people were getting married basically for political reasons. They would Sometimes marriages would last just a couple of years because the political alliance breaks down and the father wants to marry his daughter to someone else. He had that power. He could basically force her to divorce. In the event of divorce, any children, including unborn children, went with the father's family, not with the mother. So they went with the father. So even if she was pregnant, she had to bear that child, but then had to hand it over to the father. So that was, all of those stayed under the potestas, control of their father. A child would be inspected at birth to see if they were healthy. And it was only when the paterfamilias actually accepted that child into the family that they were considered to be a part of the family. So if they were healthy and likely to grow to adulthood, usually they would do that. But if, for example, the baby was very sickly, or had some kind of illness or something like that, or disability, then often the baby would be exposed, was the term, which basically meant left outside. Sometimes on a mountain, a hilltop, something like that. Sounds a bit rough, was a bit rough. In theory, the baby could just be left to die there, but usually slavers would come along. So slave dealers would come along and actually take the baby and raise it and then sell it as a slave. Usually still fairly young, you could sell a child slave off and make some money. So that's what usually happened. But exposure like that, as it was referred to, is something that was quite common in Greek and Roman societies. So the father of the family had that decision as to whether or not to accept that child into the family. Assuming that the child is accepted, the baby was considered to be pliable and unformed, and you needed to immediately strengthen its body and then strengthen its mind. And that, of course, what the kind of education that they received would be determined by their social class and social status, and also by their gender. So the male babies would eventually get training in government, in politics, in trades and so forth. A female would receive training in running a household, managing a household, and that's basically what she would be taught. Some women, particularly in aristocratic circles, where they had more leisure time, would also get in amongst the books and actually start academic learning as well. So that wasn't unknown, but you more had to make an effort to try and make that happen for yourself, rather than just to have it happen as a matter of course. They were usually given tutors in wealthy families, so there would be a slave whose job it was basically to educate the child. And these slaves would often be highly educated Greeks. Greeks were considered to be the most learned and educated and the best as teachers. And so most wealthy Roman families would have a slave who was a highly educated Greek, and they would actually take over the training of the children. It was considered a mark of education and refinement to be able to speak Greek as well as Latin. So Latin was the native tongue of Romans, but if you're an aristocrat, it was an expectation that you could also read and speak Greek. So that was important as well. So that was one of the reasons why these slaves who were employed to raise children and train children were often Greeks. As I mentioned before, the death rate of children was quite high. Even amongst the aristocracy, it's estimated roughly 50% of babies would die before their 10th birthday. So death of children was quite common. And later we'll look at some inscriptions from Roman tombstones, and they frequently feature children. And women quite often die young, and probably the reason for that is dying in childbirth, because of course the medical profession was nowhere near as efficient as they are today, and death in childbirth was quite common. So we often have tombstones of young women in their 20s or even younger who died probably in childbirth. Okay, slaves also formed an integral part of the familia, and so they were considered as a part of the household. They included domestic servants, they included teachers, they included labourers, and as I mentioned earlier, the amount of money that was actually paid for a slave would vary wildly depending on their fitness and health and strength and education and various other factors like that. Nationality would play a part. Sometimes, for example, when the Romans had won a great victory and they'd looted and pillaged and brought home thousands and thousands of slaves, the prices of slaves would actually drop because there were so many on the market. And then when there hadn't been a good war for a while, the price would actually go back up again because there was less available. Some would actually sell themselves into slavery, particularly those educated Greeks that I was talking about earlier. And one of the main reasons they did this was because of the fact that when you were set free by a Roman citizen, you then became a Roman citizen yourself. So it could be considered a path to Roman citizenship. And as we discussed last week, Roman citizenship certainly had some benefits. It gave you a lot of legal rights that other people in the empire did not have. And in some cases, it was considered worthwhile to actually sell yourself into slavery, usually to clear some debts that you'd incurred. And then, hopefully, after 5-10 years of service as a slave, and if you were educated, you're not going to get treated roughly, for the most part, because you're valuable. And then you'd be set free and you'd be a Roman citizen. You'd still be expected to work for your former owner, but there certainly would be a lot of incentive to do that. Valued slaves were often liberated by their masters. One of the reasons they did that was because that person then could do things that a slave couldn't. Now, we talked last week about the class of senators and how senators weren't allowed to do certain jobs. They were expected to be gentlemen farmers. They couldn't be merchants or craftsmen or something like that. But what they could do is have a former slave go into business on their behalf with money that they'd fronted up. And that was considered to be okay. So that was all right, and the senator could kind of reap the profits of that, but he needed to set a slave free, have a freedman, in order to do that. Slaves were not normally Italian because most of them came from Rome's wars, which were, generally speaking, conducted with people that weren't Italian from the outer rim of the empire. But they rapidly became assimilated into Roman society, and as I mentioned before, the sons of freedmen, and even freedmen themselves, could achieve very high rank in Roman society. One place in particular, the Familia Caesaris, where I've got it there, the household of the emperor, was a great place to be as a slave often, because you could be set free, be an imperial freedman, and then you have the chance of getting a very high-paying, prestigious and powerful job in the Roman administration and the Roman government. And the Emperor Pertinax, who became emperor in 192 AD, he was actually the son of a freedman. So you could actually get to the highest echelons of society even if your father was a slave. So that was kind of a very different sort of aspect to slavery as we see, for example, in the southern United States before the Civil War, before 1861, when the Civil War broke out. Slavery there had a racial basis. It was African Americans, people of African descent, who were enslaved, and white people weren't. That didn't exist in Rome. As I say, it was usually the case that the slaves were not Italians because they were taken in Rome's wars, which were outside Italy, but there was no actual racial basis to slavery under the Romans. Certainly they believed in ethnic stereotypes. They believed Gauls were hot-headed and lacked stamina. They believed Syrians were kind of shifty and you couldn't really trust them, and Carthaginians would stab you in the back at the first opportunity, and lots of stereotypes like that. But they seem more based sort of like on ethnicity as distinct from race. So the idea of race